Welcome to AZ-802, Practice Exam Storage and File Services Deep Dive, Set 7. This focus session includes 45 original questions on Azure Files, Azure File Sync, Windows Server Shares, FSRM, DFS, SMB over Quick, Storage Spaces Direct, Storage Replica, Data Deduplication, SMB Direct, Storage QoS, NTFS and REFS, iSCSI, and BitLocker recovery. I will read each storage and file services scenario and the answer choices. After the choices, you will hear, "Lock in your answer." Then the video pauses for a silent 3-second countdown. Pause the video if you need more time. After the countdown, I will reveal the correct answer, explain the deciding identity, protocol, resiliency, performance, migration, or recovery boundary, and share one exam clue you can transfer to another scenario. Question 1 of 45. You are deploying an Azure file share for a single site on-premises Windows Server environment. The application requires SMB access over the public endpoint. Which prerequisite must be met before the share can be mounted successfully? Option A. Ensure TCP port 445 is open and the client supports SMB 3.x. Option B. Enable NFS protocol on the storage account and open TCP port 2049. Option C. Configure a private endpoint and disable public access entirely. Option D. Assign the storage file data SMB share reader role only and use SAS tokens for mounting. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Ensure TCP port 445 is open and the client supports SMB 3.x. SMB protocol requires TCP port 445 open. Older clients without SMB 3.x cannot mount via public endpoint outside Azure. The single site on-premises public endpoint scenario directly tests the port 445 plus SMB 3.x boundary for Azure Files mounting. Question 2 of 45. In a two-site branch topology, users at a remote branch report they cannot mount an Azure file share from on-premises clients, while the hub site mounts successfully. The storage account allows public access. What is the most likely cause? Option A. The file share was created with the NFS protocol instead of SMB. Option B. The remote branch ISP or firewall is blocking TCP port 445. Option C. Azure File Sync cloud tiering is enabled and the branch lacks a registered server. Option D. The storage account key is expired and must be regenerated. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. The remote branch ISP or firewall is blocking TCP port 445. SMB connectivity over public endpoint fails when port 445 is blocked by ISP/firewall. A common two-site branch troubleshooting scenario. Two-site branch topology plus public SMB mount failure isolates the port 445 connectivity boundary between sites. Question 3 of 45. During a hybrid migration cutover, you assign the SMB share contributor RBAC role at the share level to a group. After mounting with identity-based auth, users can list files but cannot write. What must be configured next to enable writes? Option A. Assign the storage file data SMB share elevated contributor role instead. Option B. Enable anonymous access on the storage account SMB settings. Option C. Configure Windows NTFS ACLs, directory file level, granting modify or write permissions. Option D. Remount the share using the storage account key to bypass ACL enforcement. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Configure Windows NTFS ACLs, directory/file level, granting modify or write permissions. Share level RBAC, contributor, gates access. Granular writes require corresponding NTFS ACLs. Most restrictive of the two wins. Hybrid migration cutover scenario tests the interaction boundary between share-level RBAC and file directory NTFS ACLs. Question 4 of 45. In a Windows Server failover cluster topology hosting Azure file shares via Azure File Sync, an administrator needs to modify NTFS ACLs on files after an existing ACL denies access. Which RBAC role enables the required take ownership action without using the storage account key? Option A, storage file data SMB share reader. Option B, storage account contributor. Option C, owner role on the storage account. Option D, storage file data SMB admin. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D, storage file data SMB admin. Storage file data SMB admin role grants the take ownership, read-write file backup semantics actions needed to manage ACLs when existing permissions deny access. Failover cluster plus security/access boundary scenario isolates the SMB admin role's take ownership capability for ACL management. Question 5 of 45. You are planning Azure File Sync for a disconnected recovery site topology with limited bandwidth. The on-premises server runs Windows Server 2019. Which combination of prerequisites must be satisfied before installing the Azure File Sync agent and creating the server endpoint? Option A. Install KB 5005112 and KB 5040430. Ensure the admin has Azure File Sync administrator role plus reader and data access on the storage account, and pre-create the storage sync service in the same region as the file share. Option B. Enable SMB 3.0 only on the storage account, assign only storage account contributor, and skip the storage sync service creation. Option C. Use Windows Server 2012 R2 with KB 5021653 only. Assign contributor on the storage sync service, and register the server before creating any cloud endpoint. Option D. Disable storage account key access. Rely solely on managed identity and create the cloud endpoint before registering any server. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Install KB 5005112 and KB 5040430. Ensure the admin has Azure File Sync administrator role plus reader and data access on the storage account, and pre-create the storage sync service in the same region as the file share. Disconnected recovery site demands correct Windows updates, 2019 KBs, precise RBAC, Azure File Sync Administrator plus storage data roles, and storage sync service in the file share region before agent install and endpoint creation. Disconnected recovery site plus capacity/resiliency decision tests the full prerequisite matrix, updates, roles, service placement for Azure File Sync in constrained topologies. Question 6 of 45. You are deploying Azure File Sync for a multi-tenant file service that must support independent sync groups per tenant while using a single storage sync service. Which two components must be created to isolate tenant data and enable per tenant server endpoints? Option A. A separate sync group for each tenant. Option B. A server endpoint per registered server within each tenant sync group. Option C. One storage sync service per tenant. Option D. A single cloud endpoint shared across all tenants. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A and B. Option A. A separate sync group for each tenant. Option B. A server endpoint per registered server within each tenant sync group. Each tenant requires its own sync group containing a unique cloud endpoint to an isolated Azure file share, and independent server endpoints registered against that sync group. The storage sync service itself remains shared. The phrase independent sync groups per tenant combined with single storage sync service points directly to per sync group isolation rather than per service tenancy. Question 7 of 45. An Azure VM-based file server registered with Azure FileSync shows healthy share availability in the Azure portal, yet users report sync delays. Which monitoring approach identifies the actual sync health issue? Option A. Check only the Azure file share metrics for availability. Option B. Review server endpoint health and sync telemetry in the Storage Sync service. Option C. Monitor only Windows file share SMB connections. Option D. Inspect storage account diagnostic logs for read latency. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Review server endpoint health and sync telemetry in the Storage Sync service. Server endpoint health and sync telemetry in the Storage Sync service provide the authoritative view of synchronization status, separate from mere share reachability. The contrast between healthy share availability and sync delays signals that share metrics alone are insufficient. Endpoint telemetry is required. Question 8 of 45. You are performing a cutover migration of a Windows Server 2025 file server to Azure File Sync. During validation, you must confirm that sync is healthy before redirecting clients. Which single action provides the most reliable confirmation? Option A. Verify that the Azure file share is reachable via SMB from the server. Option B. Run get massages server endpoint locally and inspect only the last sync time. Option C. Check the registered server health status and server endpoint sync status in the Azure portal. Option D. Review Windows Event Viewer for any storage-related warnings. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Check the registered server health status and server endpoint sync status in the Azure portal. The Azure Portal Storage Sync Service view of registered server health and server endpoint sync status is the authoritative source required before client redirection during cutover. The scenario specifies a cutover migration on Windows Server 2025, requiring the cloud-side authoritative health check rather than local-only or share-only checks. Question 9 of 45. A legacy DFS namespace with DFS replication is being migrated to Azure FileSync on a multi-site legacy file server environment. Which statement correctly distinguishes the migration approach? Option A. Azure FileSync replaces both the DFS namespace and DFS replication with a single cloud endpoint. Option B. DFS replication must be retained alongside Azure FileSync server endpoints. Option C. Clients must be reconfigured to point directly at Azure file shares. The DFS namespace cannot be preserved. Option D. The DFS namespace remains for client access continuity, while Azure FileSync sync groups replace DFS replication. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. The DFS namespace remains for client access continuity, while Azure FileSync sync groups replace DFS replication. DFS namespace continuity is preserved for clients, while Azure FileSync sync groups and cloud endpoints replace the role of DFS replication for multi-site synchronization. The phrase distinguish DFS namespace continuity from DFS replication replacement directly identifies that the namespace stays while replication is superseded. Question 10 of 45. In a single-site on-premises DFS deployment, capacity and resiliency planning for Azure FileSync migration requires deciding where to place the cloud endpoint. Which decision correctly balances capacity and resiliency? Option A. Use a provisioned v2 Azure file share in the same region as the Storage Sync service with appropriate quota sizing. Option B. Place the cloud endpoint in a different region from the storage account to gain geo-redundancy. Option C. Rely on the on-premises server's local disks for primary capacity and use Azure Files only for backup. Option D. Enable cloud tiering on the server endpoint without first sizing the Azure file share quota. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Use a provisioned v2 Azure file share in the same region as the storage sync service with appropriate quota sizing. A provisioned v2 file share in the same region as the storage sync service provides the required capacity and resiliency foundation for the sync group, while respecting regional affinity constraints. The topology single site on premises combined with capacity resiliency decision points to same region provisioned v2 share sizing rather than cross-region or cache-only approaches. Question 11 of 45. A company with 2 branch offices plans to migrate on-premises SMB file shares to Azure Files while maintaining local caching at each site during the transition. They have performed discovery with Azure Migrate and assessed that direct lift and shift is viable. Which migration approach best preserves file ACLs, timestamps, and directory structure with minimal downtime for this 2-site topology? Option A. Use Azure File Sync with cloud endpoints only and no server endpoints. Option B. Perform a direct copy using Azure Storage Explorer or RoboCopy to new Azure file shares after creating the shares in assessment phase. Option C. Migrate first to Azure VM file servers, then enable Azure File Sync. Option D. Enable Azure File Sync server endpoints on both branches without prior discovery or assessment. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Perform a direct copy using Azure Storage Explorer or RoboCopy to new Azure file shares after creating the shares in assessment phase. Direct migration after Azure Migrate Discovery and Assessment allows setting root ACLs first, then copying with tools that preserve fidelity, ACLs, timestamps, attributes, to native Azure file shares, fitting the 2-site branch topology with configuration decision for minimal downtime. Direct Azure Files migration versus hybrid cache extension. Set ACLs on root before bulk copy. Question 12 of 45. During troubleshooting of an Azure File Sync deployment in a hybrid on-premises and Azure topology, sync errors occur between a registered server and the cloud endpoint. Health metrics show the storage sync service is healthy, but server endpoint reports conflicts. Which component separation explains why share availability alone does not indicate sync health? Option A. The cloud endpoint is the only component that can report telemetry to the storage sync service. Option B. Registered server status depends solely on the storage sync service being online. Option C. Sync group membership and server endpoint registration are independent of the underlying Azure file share availability. Option D. Cloud tiering decisions override server endpoint health checks. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Sync group membership and server endpoint registration are independent of the underlying Azure file share availability. The claim boundary requires separating storage sync service, sync group, cloud endpoint, registered server, and server endpoint roles. Share availability is not a proxy for sync telemetry or endpoint health in troubleshooting diagnosis. Separate roles of storage sync service, sync group, cloud endpoint, registered server, server endpoint. Telemetry versus share availability. Question 13 of 45. In a failover cluster topology, an organization must cut over clustered file shares to Azure Files, while preserving all NTFS permissions and alternate data streams where possible. Assessment shows some shares exceed supported fidelity limits. What is the correct migration/cutover decision sequence? Option A. Migrate directly with RoboCopy Mir and rely on Azure Files to replicate cluster quorum. Option B. Use Azure File Sync on each cluster node after configuring file server role, then perform cutover by updating client referrals post-assessment. Option C. Enable SMB over quick on the cluster and redirect all traffic without assessment. Option D. Run discovery and assessment with Azure Migrate, set root ACLs first on target shares, copy preserving supported metadata, then validate fidelity and cutover clients after confirming unsupported alternate streams remain on premises. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Run discovery and assessment with Azure Migrate. Set root ACLs first on target shares, copy preserving supported metadata, then validate fidelity and cut over clients after confirming unsupported alternate streams remain on premises. Hard difficulty requires distinguishing direct migration, hybrid cache, assessment, cutover in failover cluster. Set ACLs before bulk copy. Preserve supported metadata, ACLs, timestamps, attributes. Note limits on alternate data streams. Assessment before cutover. Root ACLs first. Fidelity limits on alternate data streams in direct Azure Files migration for clustered topology. Question 14 of 45. A disconnected recovery site uses Windows Server file shares accessed via SMB. Security policy requires combining share and NTFS permissions while preserving protocol constraints. Which two statements correctly describe the effective access model for this topology? Option A. Share permissions are evaluated first, and then NTFS permissions are applied. The most restrictive result wins. Option B. NTFS permissions alone determine access when connecting over SMB. Share permissions are ignored in modern Windows Server. Option C. Effective access is the intersection, most restrictive, of share and NTFS permissions. Option D. SMB encryption settings can override permission evaluation order in a multi-tenant recovery site. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A and C. Option A. Share permissions are evaluated first, and then NTFS permissions are applied. The most restrictive result wins. Option C. Effective access is the intersection, most restrictive, of share and NTFS permissions. For disconnected recovery site security/access boundary, effective access is always the most restrictive combination of share and NTFS permissions. Share permissions evaluated with NTFS. Most restrictive effective access equals share and NTFS. Preserve protocol/security constraints, SMB. Question 15 of 45. In a multi-tenant file service topology on Windows Server, capacity planning shows high contention on shared volumes. Which configuration decision best balances resiliency and access control while honoring the most restrictive effective permissions model? Option A. Create separate shares per tenant with unique share permissions combined with NTFS and place on distinct volumes. Option B. Use a single share and rely only on NTFS permissions for tenant isolation. Option C. Enable SMB direct RDMA on the shared volume and ignore share permissions. Option D. Configure FSRM file screens instead of permission layers for capacity control. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Create separate shares per tenant with unique share permissions, combined with NTFS, and place on distinct volumes. Multi-tenant requires separate shares per tenant plus NTFS for most restrictive effective access, on distinct volumes for capacity/resiliency in this topology. Separate shares plus NTFS, most restrictive. Distinct volumes for multi-tenant capacity/resiliency. Question 16 of 45. You are configuring an Azure VM running Windows Server to host file shares. The requirement is to prevent users from storing audio files in department shares while allowing quota notifications. Which FSRM feature directly addresses the file type restriction? Option A. Quota management with a hard quota template. Option B. File screening management to block specific extensions such as .mp3. Option C. Storage reports scheduled for weekly disk usage trends. Option D. File classification infrastructure with dynamic access control rules. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. File screening management to block specific extensions such as .mp3. File screening in FSRM allows creation of file screens that block specified file extensions on NTFS volumes, directly meeting the audio file restriction need on an Azure VM file server. Azure VM Workload plus Configuration Decision isolates the file screening capability of FSRM for extension-based blocking versus quota or reporting features. Question 17 of 45. In a Windows Server 2025 deployment on an Azure VM, FSRM file classification rules are not triggering on newly created files despite correct classification properties. Users report that real-time classification appears disabled. What is the most likely cause? Option A. The volume uses REFS instead of NTFS. Option B. The File Server Resource Manager role service is not installed. Option C. FSRM change journal creation was intentionally skipped via registry settings to conserve space. Option D. Storage reports are configured, but file management tasks are disabled. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. FSRM change journal creation was intentionally skipped via registry settings to conserve space. Preventing FSRM from creating change journals via skip USN creation for system or skip USN creation for volumes registry disables real-time classification, while other FSRM features may still operate. This is a Windows Server 2025 Plus behavior on the Azure VM. Windows Server 2025 deployment plus troubleshooting diagnosis tests the specific trade-off of skipping USN journal creation for space versus disabling real-time FSRM classification. Question 18 of 45. During a legacy file server migration, the team must preserve existing UNC paths for applications while moving data to new servers. DFS namespaces are being implemented. Which DFS component must be configured first to maintain namespace continuity without immediate data movement? Option A. DFS replication group with a full mesh topology between old and new servers. Option B. Storage sync service cloud endpoint for the target Azure file share. Option C. File server resource manager quotas applied to the new target folders. Option D. A DFS namespace with folder targets pointing to the legacy server shares. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. A DFS namespace with folder targets pointing to the legacy server shares. DFS namespace provides the abstraction layer and referral service that preserves UNC paths for clients, while folder targets can later be updated or replicated. Replication, DFSR, is a separate data movement step. Legacy file server migration plus migration cutover decision isolates the DFS namespace referral mechanism from DFS replication data movement. Question 19 of 45. In a single-site on-premises environment, clients must access shared folders through a unified namespace, while certain folders require access restricted to specific security groups. Which DFS feature combination satisfies both the unified path and the access boundary requirement? Option A. DFS namespace only, with folder targets and NTFS permissions on the underlying shares. Option B. DFS replication, with read-only targets and share-level permissions. Option C. Azure File Sync with cloud tiering and Azure RBAC only. Option D. FSRM file screens combined with storage reports. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. DFS namespace only, with folder targets and NTFS permissions on the underlying shares. DFS namespace supplies the unified UNC path via referrals. Access control is enforced by NTFS permissions on the target shares, meeting both requirements in a single-site topology. Single-site on-premises plus security/access boundary tests, the DFS namespace handles path abstraction, while NTFS, not DFSR, handles the access restriction. Question 20 of 45. A two-site branch topology requires secure SMB access from remote clients without opening TCP 445 or deploying a VPN. The servers are Windows Server 2025. Which configuration enables this while preserving native SMB semantics? Option A. Enable SMB Direct with RDMA adapters and configure IPsec. Option B, configure SMB over quick on the server. Open UDP/TCP443 and use supported client certificates or Kerberos. Option C, deploy Azure File Sync with private endpoint and ExpressRoute. Option D, enable SMB multi-channel and require SMB encryption only. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Configure SMB over quick on the server, open UDP/TCP443, and use supported client certificates or Kerberos. SMB over quick transports SMB traffic over quick TLS on UDP TCP443, allowing secure access without exposing port 445 or requiring VPN, exactly matching the two-site branch capacity resiliency need on supported Windows Server versions. Two-site branch topology plus capacity/resiliency decision isolates SMB over quick as the mechanism that bypasses traditional port 445 while keeping native SMB semantics. Question 21 of 45. You manage a hybrid on-premises and Azure environment where a Windows Server 2025 file server in a branch office must serve SMB clients over the internet without exposing TCP445. The design requires a certificate-based encrypted tunnel that survives client IP changes and supports existing SMB features. Which configuration satisfies the topology requirement? Option A, enable SMB Direct with RDMA adapters and require clients to connect via TCP445 only. Option B, deploy a site-to-site VPN and force all SMB traffic through the VPN tunnel while leaving TCP445 open. Option C, install a server authentication certificate with DNS SANS, enable SMB over quick on UDP443, and configure clients to fall back to quick when TCP fails. Option D, enable NFS over quick on the server and require clients to mount via UDP 2049 with TLS. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Install a server authentication certificate with DNS SANS, enable SMB over quick on UDP443, and configure clients to fall back to quick when TCP fails. SMB over quick on Windows Server 2025 uses a PKI certificate with DNS SANS, binds to UDP443, and provides the required encrypted, resilient SMB transport for hybrid internet scenarios, while preserving all SMB features. Hybrid on-premises and Azure Plus configuration decision isolates the certificate plus UDP443 plus quick transport boundary, distinct from RDMA or VPN solutions. Question 22 of 45. A failover cluster running Windows Server 2025 experiences inconsistent SMB performance across nodes during high concurrency file access. The cluster uses multiple network paths. Which two SMB multi-channel settings must be verified to resolve the troubleshooting diagnosis? Option A, enable SMB multi-channel on all cluster nodes and confirm that the NICs support RSS and VMQ. Option B, force SMB 2.0 dialect only and disable encryption to reduce CPU overhead. Option C, disable SMB signing on all shares and require NTLM v1 authentication. Option D, configure the cluster to prefer the highest bandwidth NICs and enable automatic interface discovery. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A and D. Option A, enable SMB multi-channel on all cluster nodes and confirm that the NICs support RSS and VMQ. Option D, configure the cluster to prefer the highest bandwidth NICs and enable automatic interface discovery. SMB multi-channel in failover clusters requires enabled multi-channel with RSS VMQ capable NICs plus automatic highest bandwidth path selection. These two settings directly address multipath performance in clustered topologies. Failover cluster plus troubleshooting diagnosis tests the exact SMB multi-channel requirements RSS, VMQ plus autopath selection, without confusing them with dialect or signing settings. Question 23 of 45. During a migration/cutover from a disconnected recovery site, SMB sessions between the primary and recovery file servers fail when encryption is enforced. The recovery site runs an older SMB dialect. Which single change resolves the cutover issue while preserving the required security posture? Option A. Lower the minimum SMB dialect to 2.1 on both servers and disable encryption. Option B. Force SMB direct RDMA on the recovery site and require IPsec for all traffic. Option C. Disable SMB multi-channel and require a single TCP path with NTLM v2 only. Option D. Enable SMB encryption only for the specific share and allow SMB 3.1.1 negotiation on the recovery site. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Enable SMB encryption only for the specific share and allow SMB 3.1.1 negotiation on the recovery site. Enforcing per-share SMB encryption while ensuring both endpoints negotiate SMB 3.1.1 allows secure sessions during cutover without exposing older dialects or disabling required features. Disconnected recovery site plus migration/cutover decision isolates the SMB dialect plus per-share encryption boundary in a constrained topology. Question 24 of 45. In a multi-tenant file service deployment on Windows Server, you must ensure that tenant data remains isolated while allowing dynamic volume growth. Which disk and volume configuration enforces the security/access boundary? Option A. Initialize disks as GPT, create separate NTFS volumes with mount points under tenant-specific folders, and apply NTFS permissions per volume. Option B. Create one large dynamic disk, initialize as MBR, and assign a single NTFS volume mounted at the root. Option C. Use REFS volumes only and rely on share permissions without NTFS ACLs. Option D. Create a stored spaces pool across all disks and expose a single CSV without mount points. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Initialize disks as GPT. Create separate NTFS volumes with mount points under tenant-specific folders and apply NTFS permissions per volume. GPT plus separate NTFS volumes with mount points plus per volume NTFS permissions directly satisfies multi-tenant isolation and dynamic growth requirements. Multi-tenant file service plus security/access boundary tests the GPT plus mount point plus NTFS ACL combination for disk/volume configuration. Question 25 of 45. An Azure VM workload requires maximum resiliency for a high IOPS database on a Windows Server 2025 guest. The design must survive single disk failure while allowing online volume expansion without downtime. Which disk and volume topology meets the capacity resiliency decision? Option A. Attach multiple premium SSDs as basic disks, initialize as MBR, and stripe them with stored spaces parity. Option B. Attach multiple premium SSDs, initialize as GPT, create a stored spaces mirrored pool, and format as NTFS with dynamic volumes. Option C. Use a single large premium SSD, initialize as GPT, and format as REFS without mirroring. Option D. Attach disks as dynamic, create a simple volume, and rely on Azure Disk Snapshots for recovery. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Attach multiple premium SSDs, initialize as GPT, create a storage spaces mirrored pool, and format as NTFS with dynamic volumes. GPT plus storage spaces mirror provides disk failure tolerance and supports online expansion for Azure VM high IOPS workloads, while meeting the exact resiliency requirement. Azure VM workload plus capacity/resiliency decision isolates the GPT plus storage spaces mirror topology for disk/volume configuration under failure and growth constraints. Question 26 of 45. You are configuring storage on a standalone Windows Server 2025 machine with 4 attached SAS drives. The requirement is to create a single pool that can tolerate the failure of one drive while maximizing usable capacity for general file workloads. Which storage space's resiliency type meets the requirement without using cluster features? Option A. Create a storage spaces direct cluster and use mirrored virtual disks across nodes. Option B. Create a simple storage pool with striped virtual disks. Option C. Create a mirrored storage pool with two-way mirror virtual disks. Option D. Create a parity storage pool with dual parity virtual disks. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Create a mirrored storage pool with two-way mirror virtual disks. On a standalone Windows Server 2025, traditional storage spaces supports two-way mirrored virtual disks from a pool of local attached drives to tolerate one drive failure. Standalone Windows Server 2025 plus 4 SAS drives plus tolerate one failure isolates traditional storage spaces mirror, not S2D or simple/parity variants. Question 27 of 45. During migration of a legacy file server to Windows Server 2025, the existing storage spaces pool from the old server fails to import on the new standalone server. The drives are recognized, but the pool shows as failed. What is the most likely cause? Option A. The new server requires storage spaces direct to import pools created on previous versions. Option B. Storage spaces pools are not portable across servers. The drives must be reconfigured from scratch on the target server. Option C. Legacy pools require conversion to REFS before import on Windows Server 2025. Option D. The pool metadata is stored on the drives, and the new server must run the same Windows Server version or use the import storage pool commandlet with force. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. The pool metadata is stored on the drives, and the new server must run the same Windows Server version or use the import storage pool commandlet with force. Traditional storage spaces pool metadata resides on the member drives. Import succeeds on a compatible standalone server using the correct PowerShell import steps. Legacy file server migration plus standalone server plus pool import failure points to pool metadata import process on traditional storage spaces, not S2D. Question 28 of 45. You are planning the cutover of a single-site on-premises file workload to a new 2-node storage spaces direct cluster on Windows Server 2025. The nodes have identical local NVMe and SSD drives. Which configuration step is required before creating the first storage spaces direct pool? Option A. Validate the cluster with test cluster and ensure the drives are visible to both nodes before enabling storage spaces direct. Option B. Run enable cluster storage spaces direct only after creating a traditional storage spaces pool on each node. Option C. Configure a witness disk on an external SAN before enabling storage spaces direct. Option D. Install the failover clustering feature and create a traditional mirrored storage spaces pool first. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Validate the cluster with test cluster and ensure the drives are visible to both nodes before enabling storage spaces direct. S2D on a single-site 2-node cluster requires successful cluster validation and drive visibility to both nodes before enabling the feature and creating pools. Single-site on-premises plus 2-node S2D cutover isolates the cluster validation plus enable cluster storage spaces direct prerequisite, not traditional storage spaces. Question 29 of 45. In a 2-site branch topology, an administrator attempts to grant an application service account access to a CSV volume on a storage spaces direct cluster. The account can read but cannot write to files on the volume. even though NTFS permissions allow write. What is the root cause? Option A. The service account lacks the required Storage Spaces Direct CSV ownership role assignment at the cluster level. Option B. The service account is not a member of the local administrators group on the cluster nodes, and the share is using access-based enumeration with strict security. Option C. The volume is mounted on only one node, and the branch site lacks SMB multi-channel or proper referral configuration. Option D. Storage Spaces Direct CSV volumes enforce REFS-only security descriptors that override NTFS ACLs for non-domain accounts. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. The service account is not a member of the local administrators group on the cluster nodes, and the share is using access-based enumeration with strict security. In S2D two-site scenarios, effective write access on CSV often fails due to missing local admin membership combined with share-level or ABE security boundaries on the clustered file share. Two-site branch topology plus S2D CSV write failure, despite NTFS writes, isolates the cluster node local group membership, plus share security boundary, not traditional storage spaces or S2D pool creation. Question 30 of 45. You are designing a hybrid on-premises and Azure Storage Replica solution for a critical file workload. The primary site must achieve zero data loss, while the Azure Replica site tolerates higher latency. Which two configuration choices satisfy the requirements? Option A. Configure synchronous replication for the primary to Azure leg and asynchronous for the reverse direction. Option B. Use synchronous replication between two on-premises servers at the primary site and asynchronous replication from primary to the Azure VM replica. Option C. Place the replication log volume on SSD at both ends and size it to at least the expected write burst for the recovery point objective. Option D. Enable compression and encryption on the asynchronous leg only, while leaving the synchronous leg uncompressed. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are B and C. Option B. Use synchronous replication between two on-premises servers at the primary site and asynchronous replication from primary to the Azure VM replica. Option C. Place the replication log volume on SSD at both ends and size it to at least the expected write burst for the recovery point objective. Hybrid zero loss intent is met by synchronous replication locally /on-prem combined with async to Azure. Log volume sizing on SSD is mandatory for both modes to handle write bursts without RPO violation. Hybrid on-premises /Azure plus zero data loss primary with latency-tolerant Azure Replica isolates, synchronous local plus async remote, plus dedicated log volume requirements for Storage Replica. Question 31 of 45. You are deploying Storage Replica between two Windows Server 2025 nodes in a failover cluster stretched across two sites connected by a 10 gigabit per second link with 4 millisecond latency. The requirement is zero data loss for a critical database volume while allowing the secondary site to be more than 100 kilometers away. Which replication mode and volume configuration satisfies the constraints? Option A. Configure asynchronous replication with a 1 terabyte log volume on each node. Option B. Configure asynchronous replication using a single combined data plus log volume on each node. Option C. Configure synchronous replication with separate data and log volumes sized at least 10 gigabytes each on identical sector-sized disks. Option D. Configure synchronous replication only when both sites are within the same rack using RDMA. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Configure synchronous replication with separate data and log volumes sized at least 10 gigabytes each on identical sector-sized disks. Synchronous mode guarantees zero data loss, RPO equals 0, within supported latency. Separate, identically sized log volumes on matching sector disks are required for server-to-server replication in a stretched cluster. Failover cluster plus stretched sites plus zero data loss plus distance isolates synchronous replication with dedicated log volumes, not async or combined volumes. Question 32 of 45. A Windows Server 2025 file server at a disconnected recovery site shows 85% volume utilization on a 20 terabyte REFS volume after a recent full restore from backup. Data deduplication was enabled with default settings before the outage, but post-restore optimization jobs are failing with scrubbing errors. What is the most likely cause? Option A. REFS volumes do not support data deduplication. The feature requires NTFS. Option B. The deduplication schedule is disabled after restore. Manual start dedupe job type optimization must be run first. Option C. Deduplication cannot run on volumes larger than 10 terabytes. The volume must be split before enabling dedupe. Option D. Post-restore data contains corrupted chunk store references that trigger scrubbing failures. Unoptimized files must be rehydrated and re-optimized after integrity repair. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Post-restore data contains corrupted chunk store references that trigger scrubbing failures. Unoptimized files must be rehydrated and re-optimized after integrity repair. After a full restore on a disconnected site, deduplication chunk stores often have reference inconsistencies that cause scrubbing to fail. Rehydrating and re-optimizing after repair is required. Disconnected recovery site plus post-restore plus scrubbing errors on deduplicated REFS volume isolates. Chunk store integrity repair workflow, not format or size limits. Question 33 of 45. During migration of a multi-tenant file service from Windows Server 2019 to Windows Server 2025, you enable data deduplication on several NTFS volumes that host user home folders and shared departmental data. Which default deduplication setting is safe to leave unchanged for these typical file server workloads? Option A. Minimum files double files set to 32 KB with a default chunk size. Option B. Minimum file age days set to 0, optimize all files immediately. Option C. Optimize in use files enabled. Option D. Maximum set to 1 terabyte and exclude all .pst files. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Minimum fification set to 32 KB with a default chunk size. The default minimum file size of 32 kilobytes and standard chunking behavior are appropriate and safe for typical home folder and departmental workloads during migration. Multi-tenant file service migration plus NTFS volumes plus safe unchanged default isolates the 32 kilobyte minimum file size setting, not aggressive or custom exclusions. Question 34 of 45. You are configuring an Azure VM running Windows Server 2025 as a file server for a high-performance analytics workload. The VM has multiple network adapters, some RDMA capable via SR-IOV. Which configuration correctly enables SMB Direct while preserving compatibility with non-RDMA clients? Option A. Enable SMB multi-channel and rely on it to automatically use RDMA when available. Option B. Install the SMB Direct feature, ensure RDMA adapters are bound, and verify with Get SMB Client Network Interface showing RDMA capability. Option C. Enable SMB over Quick on the Azure VM to tunnel RDMA traffic over UDP 443. Option D. Configure the RDMA adapters in a team and force SMB Dialect 3.1.1 with signing disabled. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Install the SMB Direct feature, ensure RDMA adapters are bound, and verify with Get SMB Client Network Interface showing RDMA capability. SMB Direct requires the SMB Direct feature plus RDMA-capable adapters verified via Get SMB Client Network Interface. Non-RDMA clients continue to use standard SMB over TCP. Azure VM workload plus RDMA adapters plus SMB Direct isolates the SMB Direct feature installation plus adapter verification, not multi-channel alone or quick. Question 35 of 45. A Windows Server 2025 deployment on physical hardware with two RDMA-capable 25 gigabit per second adapters must support both low-latency RDMA traffic for a local analytics cluster and standard SMB access from legacy clients that lack RDMA. Which topology decision meets the capacity and resiliency requirements? Option A. Place both RDMA adapters in a single SMB multi-channel session and disable SMB Direct. Option B. Configure RDMA only on one adapter and use the second adapter exclusively for SMB over QuIC. Option C. Enable SMB Direct on the RDMA adapters while leaving standard TCP paths available on the same or additional interfaces for legacy clients. Option D. Require all clients to use SMB Direct by mandating RDMA-capable NICs and Windows Server 2025 or later. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Enable SMB Direct on the RDMA adapters while leaving standard TCP paths available on the same or additional interfaces for legacy clients. SMB Direct runs on RDMA adapters for low-latency workloads, while standard SMB over TCP remains available on the same or other interfaces, satisfying both performance and legacy client requirements on Windows Server 2025. Windows Server 2025 deployment plus RDMA adapters plus legacy clients plus capacity resiliency isolates, enabling SMB Direct alongside TCP fallback, not forcing RDMA everywhere or QuIC. Question 36 of 45. During a legacy file server migration to Windows Server 2025, you deploy a scale-out file server cluster with Hyper-V compute nodes. Several VMs on the new cluster experience inconsistent storage performance due to one VM consuming excessive IOPS on shared volumes. You need to enforce policy-based minimum and maximum performance goals in normalized IOPS without relying on network QoS or volume capacity quotas. Which Storage QoS deployment satisfies the requirement? Option A. Configure NTFS quotas on the CSV volumes to limit each VM's storage consumption. Option B. Apply network QoS policies on the SMB3 network adapters of the Hyper-V hosts. Option C. Use storage spaces direct with mirrored virtual disks and enable deduplication. Option D. Enable Storage QoS policies on the scale-out file server cluster policy manager and assign them to the VMs via the Hyper-V host. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Enable Storage QoS policies on the scale-out file server cluster policy manager and assign them to the VMs via the Hyper-V host. Storage QoS on a scale-out file server cluster uses the central policy manager to monitor and enforce normalized IOPS policies for Hyper-V VMs, directly mitigating noisy neighbors while distinguishing from capacity or network controls. Legacy migration plus scale-out file server plus Hyper-V VMs plus normalized IOPS min-max isolates, Storage QoS policy manager, not quotas, network QoS, or S2D. Question 37 of 45. On a single-site on-premises Windows Server 2025 Hyper-V host using cluster shared volumes, you notice that Storage QoS policies assigned to several VMs are not being enforced, and VMs continue to experience I/O contention. The policy manager shows the policies as valid. What is the most likely cause? Option A. The Hyper-V hosts are not joined to the same failover cluster as the storage nodes, breaking the feedback loop. Option B. Storage QoS requires a scale-out file server cluster. CSV alone does not activate the policy manager. Option C. Normalized IOPS policies only apply when VMs are stored on SMB shares, not on local CSV. Option D. The VMs must be restarted after policy assignment for the policy manager to begin monitoring. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. The Hyper-V hosts are not joined to the same failover cluster as the storage nodes, breaking the feedback loop. In the CSV scenario, Storage QoS requires the compute, Hyper-V, cluster, and storage nodes to participate in the failover cluster, so the policy manager can communicate policies and receive performance feedback. Single site on-premises plus CSV plus policy manager shows valid but no enforcement points to missing failover cluster membership between compute and storage nodes. Question 38 of 45. You are planning a two-site branch topology migration from legacy Windows file servers to Windows Server 2025. The workloads include high-density VDI golden images and SQL Server databases that require block cloning and integrity scrubbing. You must choose file systems that provide the required features while preserving the ability to use existing NTFS permissions during cutover. Which two file system choices meet the requirements? Option A. Keep the existing NTFS volumes and enable REFS block cloning via REFS util on a separate tier. Option B. Format all volumes as REFS with integrity streams and block cloning enabled. Option C. Format everything as NTFS and rely on deduplication and shadow copies for integrity. Option D. Use REFS for the VDI and SQL volumes and retain NTFS for user home directories that require granular ACL migration. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are B and D. Option B. Format all volumes as REFS with integrity streams and block cloning enabled. Option D. Use REFS for the VDI and SQL volumes and retain NTFS for user home directories that require granular ACL migration. REFS delivers block cloning for VDI, SQL efficiency, and integrity streams for scrubbing. NTFS is retained only where ACL continuity during migration is critical, and REFS feature parity is not required. Two-site branch plus VDI/SQL block cloning plus integrity scrubbing plus ACL migration isolates REFS for performance workloads plus NTFS for permission continuity. Exactly two orthogonal choices. Question 39 of 45. In a hybrid on-premises and Azure topology, you must protect a set of branch office file shares that will be extended to Azure Files, while maintaining local performance. One volume contains mission-critical databases that benefit from REFS block cloning and automatic data integrity verification. Another volume stores user documents that require full NTFS feature compatibility, including certain third-party encryption filters. Which file system configuration satisfies the hybrid security and access boundary requirements? Option A. Format both volumes as REFS and rely on Azure Files for cross-protocol access. Option B. Format the database volume as REFS and the document volume as NTFS, ensuring Azure File Sync endpoints respect the respective file system capabilities. Option C. Format all volumes as NTFS and enable REFS features through Azure Files tiering only. Option D. Use a single REFS volume for everything and convert NTFS ACLs to REFS metadata during Azure cutover. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Format the database volume as REFS and the document volume as NTFS, ensuring Azure File Sync endpoints respect the respective file system capabilities. REFS is chosen for its resilience and cloning benefits on the database workload, while NTFS preserves required third-party filter and ACL compatibility on the document workload in the hybrid Azure Files scenario. Hybrid on-premises/Azure plus database block cloning/integrity versus document. NTFS filter/ACL boundary isolates. REFS for one workload plus NTFS for the other. Question 40 of 45. You are designing capacity and resiliency for a failover cluster that will host iSCSI targets for multiple application workloads. The cluster must support MPIO for path redundancy and CHAP authentication, while keeping initiator, target, LUN, portal, and security roles clearly separated. Which iSCSI configuration decision meets the capacity resiliency requirements without conflating roles? Option A. Use a single iSCSI portal for all targets and rely on SMB multi-channel for redundancy instead of MPIO. Option B. Configure CHAP only on the initiator and allow anonymous access on the target to simplify management. Option C. Deploy the iSCSI target server role on the failover cluster nodes, create virtual disks as LUNs, configure MPIO on initiators, and enable CHAP at the target level. Option D. Create one large virtual disk LUN and present it to all initiators through a single portal without MPIO. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Deploy the iSCSI target server role on the failover cluster nodes, create virtual disks as LUNs, configure MPIO on initiators, and enable CHAP at the target level. iSCSI target server on the cluster provides the target role, virtual disks become LUNs, MPIO handles initiator path resiliency, and CHAP is applied at the target while keeping all roles distinct. Failover cluster plus iSCSI plus MPIO plus CHAP plus distinct initiator/target/LUN/portal roles isolates proper iSCSI target server deployment with MPIO and CHAP. Question 41 of 45. You are deploying a disconnected recovery site using Windows Server Storage. The site must present block storage to legacy initiators over Ethernet without SMB. Which configuration correctly distinguishes the iSCSI target server role and required security boundary? Option A. Install the iSCSI initiator role service on the recovery server and configure CHAP to authenticate the target. Option B. Use the iSCSI target server only for file shares and rely on SMB Direct for block access in the recovery site. Option C. Configure MPIO on the target server and disable CHAP to simplify initiator connections across the disconnected site. Option D. Enable iSCSI target server, create a virtual disk, and configure CHAP to authenticate initiators, while optionally enabling IPsec for network traffic. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Enable iSCSI target server, create a virtual disk, and configure CHAP to authenticate initiators while optionally enabling IPsec for network traffic. iSCSI target server exposes LUNs via the iSCSI protocol. CHAP authenticates initiators to the target, and IPsec can protect the network path, matching the disconnected recovery site block storage requirement. Disconnected recovery site plus block storage over Ethernet without SMB isolates the iSCSI target server role, virtual disk creation, and CHAP IPsec boundaries. Question 42 of 45. In a multi-tenant file service running on a Windows Server failover cluster, CSV volumes encrypted with BitLocker fail to come online after a node failover. The cluster is in a workgroup configuration. What is the most likely cause? Option A. The cluster is using the legacy AZ-802 or group CNO protector instead of the cluster-generated local database protector. Option B. BitLocker was enabled without adding the feature to all cluster nodes and placing the CSV resource in maintenance mode first. Option C. CSV volumes cannot be encrypted with BitLocker when the cluster spans multiple tenants. Option D. The TPM protector is required on every CSV, and the cluster validation skipped TPM checks. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. The cluster is using the legacy AZ-802 or group CNO protector instead of the cluster-generated local database protector. In workgroup or AD-less clusters, the legacy CNO-based AD protector causes unlock delays or failures during failover because no domain controller is available. The new cluster-generated protector stored in the local cluster database is required. Multi-tenant file service plus workgroup cluster plus CSV BitLocker failover failure isolates the AID account or group versus cluster-generated protector boundary. Question 43 of 45. During migration of a legacy file server workload to an Azure VM cluster, you must enable BitLocker on CSV volumes that will host the migrated data. The environment has no on-premises domain controllers reachable from Azure. Which approach ensures the volumes unlock reliably after cutover? Option A. Enable BitLocker with the TPM plus pin protector before adding the volumes to the Azure cluster. Option B. Use the cluster-generated BitLocker key protector stored in the replicated cluster database, and ensure the system volume on each node is also protected. Option C. Configure an AID account or group protector bound to a cloud-only Microsoft Entra ID account for the CSV resources. Option D. Suspend BitLocker protectors on the source legacy server and re-enable after migration to avoid key escrow issues. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Use the cluster-generated BitLocker key protector stored in the replicated cluster database and ensure the system volume on each node is also protected. The cluster-generated protector, encrypted in the replicated cluster database, combined with protected system volumes, allows reliable unlock without AD reachability, satisfying the Azure VM workload migration cutover constraint. Azure VM workload plus legacy migration cutover plus no reachable DCs isolates the cluster-generated local database BitLocker protector requirement for CSV. Question 44 of 45. You are recovering BitLocker encrypted volumes on a Windows Server 2025 deployment after a security incident that forced a recovery key rotation. Which two statements accurately describe valid recovery actions and constraints? Option A. A recovery key can be stored on the encrypted volume itself or in the root of a non-removable drive for convenience. Option B. Helpdesk recovery from Microsoft Entra ID requires verifying user identity, recording device name and recovery key ID, then locating and providing the password before root cause analysis. Option C. After providing the 48-digit recovery password, rotate the recovery password if automatic rotation is configured via Intune or Configuration Manager. Option D. Self-recovery with a USB flash drive requires using a separate device to read the key file. The USB must not be stored with the encrypted device. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are C and D. Option C. After providing the 48-digit recovery password, rotate the recovery password if automatic rotation is configured via Intune or Configuration Manager. Option D. Self-recovery with a USB flash drive requires using a separate device to read the key file. The USB must not be stored with the encrypted device. Post-recovery password rotation is required when automatic rotation policies exist. USB self-recovery explicitly requires a separate reading device and physical separation of the USB from the encrypted device. Windows Server 2025 deployment plus security incident recovery key rotation isolates the recovery password rotation policy and USB key handling constraints for encrypted volume recovery. Question 45 of 45. During a legacy file server migration, a BitLocker protected data volume fails to unlock on the target Windows server after cutover. The recovery password was backed up to Active Directory. What single action resolves the unlock while preserving the capacity and resiliency requirements of the migration? Option A. Mount the drive as a data drive on another machine where a DRA can unlock it, then move the data. Option B. Disable the BitLocker protector on the source volume before migration so the target receives an unencrypted volume. Option C. Enter the 48-digit recovery password from ADDS at the pre-boot recovery screen or via Manage-BDE after connecting the drive to a running system. Option D. Use the BitLocker repair tool with the recovery key ID only, without retrieving the full password from AD. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Enter the 48-digit recovery password from ADDS at the pre-boot recovery screen or via manage-BDE after connecting the drive to a running system. Retrieving the 48-digit recovery password stored in ADDs and supplying it at the recovery screen or via manage-BDE directly unlocks the volume, while maintaining the encrypted state required for the legacy migration's capacity/resiliency posture. Legacy file server migration plus AD-backed recovery password isolates the 48-digit ADDS recovery password entry as the single correct unlock action for encrypted volumes. You finished the storage and file services deep dive. Sort any misses into 6 boundaries: identity and permissions, namespace versus synchronization, transport and performance, capacity and resiliency, migration and cutover, or encryption and recovery. Replay only the patterns you missed to build a precise remediation plan. Thanks for practicing with WebLizard's Cert Lab. Keep identity, data path, resiliency, performance, migration state, and recovery material in view. Then continue with the next AZ-802 deep dive when you are ready.